President of the United States ordered and executed strikes on the country of Iran. Was it legal for him to do that on his own authority? And now that we're hearing the I word again, is impeachment a possibility? I'm going to run you through a couple of concepts to explain where we are in all of this. I'm Bryan. I make videos about civics and law. Does what I'm about to explain make sense to you? It's a tough concept to get your head around. And what do you think? Will we be in another round of impeachment hearings soon? Okay, the question of whether or not the president had the authority to order these strikes on his own involves a lot of different questions, but the one that I'm going to focus on here is the political question doctrine. Because the other questions we're going to have to answer sort of filter through this. And I know I've explained it before, but stick with me for a second because it's a tough concept and it is really important. Now, of course, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but I think it'll help get the point across. At the top of our legal pantheon, we have the U.S. Constitution. The amendments of the Constitution act like little shields that protect the individuals from the federal government, but honestly, this isn't really what we're going to be talking about here today. And our three branches of government are each given individual powers from the articles of the Constitution. The judiciary gets some powers, the executive gets some powers, the legislature gets some powers. And to be a little bit more clear, let's say the legislature gets like a nice broad power, like the power to raise and support armies, for example. That's a pretty broad power because it could mean a lot of different things, right? And then let's say that Congress takes one of its powers and it wants the president to execute part of that power in a particular way. And so it writes a law using part of its power to tell the president to execute its power in a particular way. And sometimes those laws are going to be broad, sometimes they're going to be narrow. We'll make this one a little broad. So one day the president decides to execute that power that was delegated to him by Congress. But he decides to do this. He could have done this. He could have done this. He could have done this. But he did this. The court will come along and say, okay, Congress, you had this power. It was this broad. You delegated this much of that power. This action was outside of the delegated powers. It's unconstitutional, or it violates this law, whatever they want to say. But if the president decides to do this instead of this or this, if he makes any decisions that are within that power, the court will not weigh in. The court says that as long as a power has been delegated to the legislature, and the legislature, who's a group of people who've been elected, have made a decision to delegate that power to the president, who's a guy who's been elected, then if he makes a decision as the guy who's been elected within his powers, they're not going to touch it. Because that would be overruling the decision of the American people to choose him as the guy who makes that decision. The power was this broad. Somebody had to decide where within the power it was going to be executed. This is the guy that was chosen by the American people to make that decision. The court is not going to step in. That is called the political question doctrine, because an elected official is considered a political person, somebody who has run for office and been chosen by the American people. And the judiciary is not a political branch. They have not been elected, so they will not overrule the decision of the American people. So one more time, action of the president outside of his powers? Yeah, the court's coming right in and they're going to make a ruling on that. Action of a president within his powers, that's the political question doctrine. He made a decision, and he's the guy who's supposed to make it. This also applies to decisions that the president makes that are within his broad powers that come straight from the Constitution. So here, that's all up to him. Over here, nope, we've stepped outside. Now here is the problem. What about this guy right here that's right on the edge? Who is going to decide whether it was inside of the power or outside of the power? And that is where some of our political question doctrine stuff gets a little more interesting in case law. It should come as no surprise that Supreme Court justices don't always agree on whether something is within the power of the president or Congress or not. So deciding whether this action was taken within the power or outside of the power is going to sometimes come down to one of those 4 or 5 decisions. Or maybe it'll be decided at one point in history and 50 years later we'll decide that's no longer the way we feel about it. But that is generally how the judiciary decides whether or not they are allowed to weigh in on questions like this. Now, questions about the military are particularly touchy because the Supreme Court realizes that between the legislative branch and the executive branch, who both have pretty broad powers related to the military, one of them is probably responsible for making decisions related to the military. Which one is responsible for a particular part of it is a tougher question sometimes, but the Supreme Court sort of wants to keep their feet out of that fire. But the thing is, the Supreme Court, the non-political branch of government, isn't the only one who can weigh in on these questions to overrule a decision of the American people. Because Congress, which is another political branch, in fact, the House of Representatives is the most political branch because they are elected the most frequently and they're closest to their constituents physically. Congress and the House of Representatives has another option to tell the president, nope, that was not what you were supposed to do. And that option is a political option rather than a judicial option, and it is called impeachment. Impeachment may look like a judicial proceeding, but it is at its heart political, because the people who make the decisions are all elected. So this is sort of what's being discussed right now. Will the judiciary weigh in on this question of whether or not the president was allowed to make this decision on his own? Probably not. Based on history, based on what I can see in these past cases, it's very unlikely. The judiciary believes that if there is a question about whether or not he was able to do this, it is expressly the provision of the House of Representatives to make that decision and decide whether or not to impeach. So this is precisely their job at this point if he overstepped his bounds. So we're going to see this play out over the next couple of weeks probably. So far there's not a lot of discussion of impeachment, but it may get louder or it may just sort of die off. But this is why these decisions are made by Congress and not by the judiciary. All comes down to the political question doctrine and the role of elected officials in judging the decision-making skills of other elected officials. Okay, I want to thank you guys for your support. John, thank you very much. If you'd like to support me and help me keep doing this, please check my link tree. It's in my profile. There are ways to support me there. There's also copies of any documents I've used to support any of these projects or videos that I'm working on. Otherwise, keep watching, keep commenting, and I'll keep making them. Thanks a lot, guys.